7 reasons you should believe the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 are angels. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4 is one of the most fun verses to debate in the entire Bible, right? Hopefully you have friends that you like to talk about Bible things with. This verse is the most fun one to talk about. If you don't have friends who like to talk about this kind of stuff, you need to find new friends. If you want to be a friend who can talk about this stuff, this video is for you. I'm going to walk you through one of the most debated passages, and I'm going to tell you what view I think you should hold. But first, let me read for you Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Right? Those first 4 verses in chapter 6 of Genesis are the introduction to the story of Noah's flood. Right? So what's happening there is that the sons of God and the daughters of man are having some sort of relationship where they marry, they have children, and it invokes the wrath of God, and that is what leads to God deciding to destroy the entire world by flood. God looks out at the world and sees only wickedness all the time, but this sin seems to be the sin that characterizes the extreme wickedness happening in the world at the time of Noah's flood. And so what that does is it raises some really big questions. First, who are the sons of God and the daughters of men? And second, what are they doing that is so bad that it is worthy of the justice and the outpouring of the wrath of God? Why did God view what they were doing to be so horrible that he would send a worldwide flood that destroyed everybody? All right, let me give you 3 main options for considering how to interpret this passage. The first view is that the sons of God are angels and the daughters of men are human beings. In this view, the sin that is being committed is really twofold. The sin of just a gross, inappropriate kind of sexual deviancy. That there is inappropriate kind of sex that is not allowed within the rules of God, the same way that we would call homosexual sex or bestiality as outside of the way God designed human sexuality. Clearly, sexuality between humans and spiritual beings is outside of the bounds. So that is one part of this issue. The other part is that it tends to suggest a kind of sexuality that is connected to demonic worship or the worship of spirits. And so a lot of times in the Bible, we'll see things about cult prostitution, temple prostitution, sexual acts that are acts of worship as well. And you hear about that not only in the Bible, but tons of different cults and pagan worship type of things that seem to have sexuality as a part of that. People holding the angel view would see this as sort of the first and maybe most extreme version of the way sexuality takes a demonic twist and it becomes actually a kind of paganism or really a kind of idolatry and rebellion against God. And that, along with the sexual deviancy of the whole act, is what leads God to view the world as wicked and twisted and worthy of destruction by flood. All right. The second view, the second major view, is that the men, the sons of God, are godly men, usually from the line of Seth. So the idea is that of Adam's descendants, Seth was the godly son, and his other descendants, especially Cain, but any other descendants of Seth, of Adam and Eve, would have been ungodly. And Seth's children should have known not to intermarry with the ungodly lines of Adam and Eve. Some people will hold this even more generally speaking, that godly people were just marrying ungodly people, and they should have known better than this. That as that progressed, people were being given over to just general ungodliness because they were being carried away with their lusts and they were letting their intermarriage ruin their relationship with God. This is a major theme in the Bible. In the New Testament, we're told not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That applies in a broad number of ways, but certainly it applies to the way we pick husbands and wives. Christians should only marry Christians. And that's a major theme in the Old Testament as well. The Jews were not allowed to intermarry people from other faiths, other religions. They weren't allowed to marry any of the pagan women that they conquered as they moved into the land of Israel and to the promised land, the land of Canaan. And this actually becomes one of the major sins of Solomon, who takes so many wives who were of pagan descent, and those wives were able to turn Solomon's heart away from the Lord. And so that the people who hold this view see this as sort of one of the first acts and sort of predictive act of that theme that follows throughout the rest of the Bible, and see this as a call toward holiness and a call toward the people of God being separate from the people who are opposed to God. All right, the third view is that the sons of God are kings and rulers. God himself, being the king of all creation, is all of his sons would be people who take power like he has power. They have authority and strength and power, and are therefore sons of God in the fact that they have a kingly role in how they interact with people. As these kings gain power, they look at women, they see them as beautiful, and decide to take as many as they want to themselves. They become not only powerful warlords, but they become polygamists. They gather wives, marry as many wives as they can to demonstrate their power. So their sin there is polygamy, but also it's the use of power to persuade and compel women, to force them to be engaged in marriage and sexual acts with them as a way to demonstrate their power and their conquest over the world. These are the three big views: that the sons of God are angels, the sons of God are godly men who marry ungodly women, or the sons of God are ungodly men who conquer and take women to be wives for themselves. I will say there is one other view that doesn't neatly fit into any of those boxes. Those three boxes are the ones you'll see in any commentary that survey the major views. But I have run across one view that doesn't fit any of those boxes. I had a professor in seminary. His name was John Selhammer. He's passed away now. But he believed that Genesis 6, 1 through 4, were really not bad verses at all, that the sons of God marrying the daughters of men were just human beings marrying other human beings, and that was a good and right thing. Nothing wrong with it. He says we get confused because Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is the beginning of Genesis 6, which is the story of Noah. But the story of Noah Genesis 6 could have started at verse 5. And he says if you had put this at the end of chapter 5, it would have just been a way of summarizing that men and women married and had children, and even their children were great and awesome people, and that this is simply God's command to be fruitful and multiply, being worked out into the world without any sort of good or bad judgment. He's the only person I know who has that view or has put that view forward. I'm sure there are people who have been persuaded by him, but not enough that I've seen it come up in any other commentary other than his. So I thought I'd just throw that out. Anyway, those are your three views. Now what I want to do is give you 7 reasons why you should believe, just like I do, that the sons of God are angels. Reason number 1 that you should believe that the sons of God are angels is because that is what most scholars believe. It is always a good practice to believe the position that most commentaries will teach you, right? If you want to hold the position of power, if you want to be the most persuasive people, pick the position that most people are already persuaded by. And that's all I'm saying here. Gordon Wenham actually wrote in his commentary, he wrote the Genesis commentary in the Word Biblical Commentary series, and he wrote that the angel interpretation is at once the oldest view and the view of most modern commentators. So it is the view that most old scholars held, and it's the view that most modern scholars hold. Now, what that doesn't say, but sort of implies, is that there's a middle period where this wasn't the majority view. So for a while, actually starting with Augustine in the 5th century AD, all the way until really around the 1900s, the Sethite view was the most popular. Augustine popularized the idea that the sons of God were actually the godly descendants of Seth who were taken in by the ungodly daughters of men, and so that they committed the sin of Solomon, so to speak. However, before Augustine, by and large, the most popular view of all Jewish and early Christian scholars were that fallen angels were the sons of men. And that is the most popular view today. Just to give you a quick rundown of some sources to be aware of, some old Jewish sources include all 3 books of Enoch, Jubilees, the Septuagint, Philo, Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a whole collection of works, but especially the commentaries on Genesis and the Manual of Discipline that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, both talk about the sons of God being angelic beings. Also, you have the Sibylline oracles, you have Pseudo, Philo, and Sirach. Those are all ancient Jewish sources that believed that the sons of God were fallen angels. There's also a long list of teachers in the early church who held this view. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, and Ambrose are some of the major names of early church fathers who held this view. And lastly, I'll just mention some modern scholars. Some of these are people you may have heard of. Hopefully you've heard of some of these names. And I'll try to get a sample. There's too many people to give you all of their names, but I'll give you a sample of some famous people from different traditions that hopefully you have heard of. For instance, John MacArthur, Charles Ryrie, Tom Schreiner, D.A. Carson, Peter Davids, Craig Keener, Michael Heiser, Tremper Longman, James Hamilton, and the president of the seminary I graduated from, Danny Akin, all have written commentaries or books describing why they believe that the sons of God are fallen angels or angels who have had some sort of sexual relationship with human beings. So, just to restate this point, that is a lot of scholars, old and new scholars, who hold this view, and it is always wise, if you're picking a view, to pick one that the smartest of people have adhered to. Now, I'll be fair and tell you that there are smart people on the other side as well, but this is certainly the majority position of most scholarship today and most of the oldest scholarship closest to the time that the Bible was written. So there's point 1. Reason number 2 that you should believe that the sons of God refer to angels is that this is the most fun view. Now, a lot of people will say you shouldn't believe this view because it just is too weird. Sounds strange to go to public life with respectable people and tell them that you believe that there was a time when angels had some sort of sexual encounter with human beings. That sounds out there and crazy. And if you want to be a respectable person, just drop that stuff. And I just believe that the quest to be respectable is no fun. I'm joking a little bit. It is no fun. But the reality is that the Bible calls us to a world that is bigger than a purely materialistic world. And one of the things that about the Bible that is both true and exciting is that God has created a world that is bigger than the things that you can see and touch and taste and feel, that this world is made up of human, physical beings and spiritual beings. And in fact, human beings are the only ones that have a foot in both sides and on both sides of the fence. We are physical beings and spiritual beings because we have a body and a soul. I'll tell you, for me, I found that beginning to read Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, with a view toward the spiritual reality going on here, has opened my eyes to seeing this as a massive theme that isn't only here in Genesis 6, but is throughout the entire story of the Bible. I believe that the first instance of the spiritual world interacting with the physical world is in the Garden of Eden when a serpent shows up. It's actually the devil himself, a fallen angel in the form of a serpent, shows up to tempt Adam and Eve to rebel against God and to join a war with God that he had already started. In Genesis chapter 6, I believe that the spiritual beings show up again fighting a spiritual war designed to bring division between human beings and God, to separate us from God, and to create a war for our allegiance and our affection. It happens again in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11, you have the story of the Tower of Babel. God sees man trying to create a tower to get to heaven, to be with the gods. God judges humanity by dividing us into different tribes and tongues. We speak different languages, and into nation groups. And he divides the nations according to the number of the sons of God. Sons of God there again in Genesis 11, as well as, well, that's talking about Genesis 11. I'll mention that in a second. That's actually in Deuteronomy, referring to this event. But those sons of God are angels, and all of the tribes and nations that God divides at the Tower of Babel are given over to demonic rule. So that later in the New Testament, this is the kingdom of darkness. It's given over to rulers of this present age, and those are spiritual forces. The entire Bible is filled with this theme of spiritual warfare, and it's all the way throughout the Bible. When you open up the New Testament and you see Jesus casting out demons from people who have been possessed by demons, you should not think this is totally new. This is unheard of. Ever since the Garden of Eden, there has been a spiritual war in which demonic forces have interacted with human beings in a way designed to twist and pervert us and pull us away from God and the knowledge of God. This is a massive theme in the New Testament. It is a massive part of the message of the gospel itself. When Paul describes the gospel in Ephesians chapter 3, well, all of Ephesians 1, 2, and 3, but in Ephesians 3, he's really kind of praying and rejoicing about God's plan to unveil the gospel, to reveal the gospel to the church. And he says that he does that so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Right? Did you hear that? That the gospel is given in order to make God's wisdom known, not to you and me, but to rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Now, you might think, does that just mean angels in the heavenly places? And clearly not, because rulers and authorities in the heavenly places are actually evil beings. We know this because of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. It says, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. The Bible is just filled with this story of human beings being at war, or being caught in a spiritual war in which rulers and powers in the heavenly places are fighting against God, and they're fighting for the allegiance of our souls. And we saw that story not starting in the New Testament, but continuing in the New Testament, but it actually started all the way back in Genesis. Now, just to be fair, you do not have to agree that angels are the sons of God in Genesis 6 to believe that angels and demons are throughout the whole Bible. But it is helpful to point out that if you're a Christian who believes in that, the charge that this is just too weird doesn't really stick. Right? We already believe that angels and demons are in this world, that they are attacking men, can even possess human beings, and that this is part of the spiritual war that God is fighting and has won and will bring to final completion at the last judgment. And so it is no surprise to us that this war was beginning even before the time of Noah. All right, let's move on. Reason number 3 that you should believe that the sons of God in Genesis are angels is because that's what the phrase son of God means. Now, you might think that's not fair. That's what the whole debate is. If we're asking, what does sons of God mean in Genesis 6, it's not fair to say it means angels and that's what you have to believe. I get that. But what I really mean to point out here is that in every other occurrence of this phrase, it clearly means angels. Therefore, that's how we should interpret it in these two occurrences in Genesis chapter 6. If a word means something every other time it is used, we should prefer to interpret it that same way in the times where there is less clarity. All right, so now let me prove that point to you. First off, the phrase that we're talking about, sons of God, is a Hebrew phrase. I'm not great at Hebrew. I'll do my best, but the pronunciation won't be great. But the Hebrew phrase is B'nai Ha-Elohim, and that exact phrase is used 6 times in the Old Testament. Now, there are 4 other very, very similar expressions that most people connect with these 6 to make a total of 10 times this phrase is used. And of those 10 times, 8 of them seem to clearly be in reference to angelic or spiritual beings. And if 8 of the 10 are clearly in reference to spiritual beings, then we should assume that the 2 that could be actually probably are in reference to spiritual beings. So let me go through that list with you really quickly. The first 2 are obviously Genesis 6, verse 2. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. And then Genesis 6, verse 4. Afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, they bore children to them. Since those are the 2 in question, we'll just hold those for now, and we'll come back to those. But those are the 2 we're trying to define. So we're going to ask, is there any other time those words are used exactly? Now, I'm just going to go in order of books of the Bible. So we're not going in chronological order or anything like that, just in order of where they show up in the Bible. And the first one is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8. This is the exact same expression, B'nai Ha-Elohim. Deuteronomy 32:8 says in the English Standard Version, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, again, I said that's probably talking about dividing them at the Tower of Babel into language groups. When he divided mankind, it says he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, the number of the sons of God in that passage seems likely to be referring to kingdoms, and there's a number of kingdoms that it corresponds to the number of angelic beings that are called the rulers or authorities in the heavenly places. So God is breaking up languages and tribes and peoples and nations according to the rulers in the heavenly places that are in charge of these people groups. All right, moving on. I think that one may be a little bit less clear than the ones you're about to see. The next 3 all come from the book of Job. The first is in Job chapter 1, verse 6. Again, it's the exact same expression, B'nai Ha-Elohim. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. A very, very, very similar expression shows up again in Job chapter 2, verse 1. It's the same, B'nai Ha-Elohim. It says, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So this is some sort of meeting that happens in heaven. The sons of God are these rulers in the heavenly places. Satan is there. He's part of this group, and he makes a presentation to God about Job, requesting the permission to attack Job. And so this whole conversation between Satan and Job happens at this meeting where the sons of God are present, assuming that the the people present with Satan before the Lord in heaven are not human beings. We can deduce that the sons of God are angelic or spiritual beings there in Job chapters 1 and 2. The last exact expression, B'nai Ha-Elohim, the same Hebrew expression, it shows up in Job chapter 38, verse 7. In that passage, God is talking to Job, and he's asking Job, who are you to question me for the things I do? And he says, were you there when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? He's talking about this act of creation. And he's saying, Job, were you there when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy while I was creating the world? Now, the morning stars likely refer to angelic beings, and so do the sons of God. The point here is that no human beings were there when God is establishing the foundations of the earth. That when God creates the heavens and the earth, that initial creative act includes spiritual beings whom he creates, who are able to watch the rest of the 6 days of creation, where he is forming the earth into this inhabitable land. And the angels are rejoicing as they watch God create the world. Job wasn't there to see it. No human being was there to see it, but the sons of God were. Who were those sons of God? They are angelic beings. All right, we have 4 more to consider. These expressions are slightly different, and they're translated slightly different, but hopefully you'll see the connection. The next one is B'nai Elohim. This is sons of gods, but here it's translated a little bit differently. In Psalm 29, verse 1, it says, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. This could have been translated, ascribe to the Lord, O sons of gods, but for whatever reason, the English Standard Version decided to go ahead and translate this as O heavenly beings. And so again, the B'nai Elohim or the B'nai Elohim, heavenly beings. All right, moving on to Psalm 82, verse 6. Now the expression is B'nai Elyon, which is very similar again. And this it says, I say you are God's son of the Most High. So Elohim is God's in general. Elyon is a combination of Elohim and Yon, meaning Most High of the gods. And he says, you are gods, your sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Psalm 82, verse 6 seems to be explaining that these angelic beings over top of the nations and that are rebelling against God will die and face the same fate as humanity itself, that they will be thrown into everlasting death in hell forever. These are the gods or the sons of the Most High. These are spiritual beings. All right, moving on, example number 9 or the 9th example of this expression comes in Psalm 89, verse 7. The Hebrew phrase is B'nai Elim. We've seen that once before. This time it is it's in Psalm 89, 7, and it says, who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? And again, the English Standard Version translates it the same way, heavenly beings, but it's almost the exact same phrase, just slightly different, but almost the same as B'nai Elohim. This time is B'nai Elim and is referring to heavenly beings. The last one is the most different, so it's not always included when commentaries are explaining the passages, but I think it's similar enough to at least consider. Daniel chapter 3, verse 25 talks about the Bar Elohim. So in English, it reads this way, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. This is talking about the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into a fiery furnace. When Nebuchadnezzar looks into the furnace and he sees the 3 men standing there, he sees actually a 4th man, and they point out that the 4th man looks like a son of the gods, which is, he doesn't look like a normal person. He looks like a heavenly being, an angelic being. There's something shiny about him. And so Bar Elohim instead of Elohim, Bar is a different word for son. Elohim, a son of the gods. It's translated the exact same in English and again and express heavenly beings. So here's the argument. You have 10 different passages that are very similarly worded, in which son of the gods is clearly meaning heavenly beings or some sort of spiritual beings. And if in those 10 occasions, 8 of them are clear, we should think all 10 of them are clear, if they could be, that all 10 are referring to spiritual beings. So we prefer to believe that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are spiritual beings because they are in every other occurrence in the Bible. All right, moving on. Reason number 4 that you should believe that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are angels is because angels are different than humans. No duh, right? The natural reading of this passage suggests that there is some sort of contrast between the sons of God and the daughters of man. One of these things is not like the other. The sons of God and the daughters of man are not supposed to go together. Gordon Wenham, whom I quoted earlier, says in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, the contrast is between the sons of the gods on the one hand and the daughters of man on the other. The alternative interpretations presuppose that what Genesis 6 really meant was that the sons of some men married the daughters of other men. In other words, the difference wouldn't be all that extreme. Some men marrying the daughters of other men wouldn't sound all that different. The contrast wouldn't be as strong. But if the sons of God are of different essence than the daughters of men, then that contrast is much more strong, and it seems to make sense of the weight of the sons of God and daughters of men construction that we find in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. All right, moving on to reason number 5. Reason number 5 that you should believe the sons of God are angels is that it explains where the Nephilim come from. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, we've already read it. Let's read it one more time. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That's actually how this debate often comes up. Most of the time, people don't ask you who were the sons of gods or who were the sons of God. They ask you who were the Nephilim. And so if you have to bring that up, then you're going to have to talk about who the sons of God were first. But the reason they're asking this is because the natural reading of this verse is that the Nephilim are the descendants of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Now, people will say, not so fast. It does not say that the Nephilim were created because of the interaction between the sons and the daughters. It just says they were created when that happened. In other words, they happened at the same time, but one doesn't necessarily cause the other. And that is technically true. I could say the ground is wet when it rains, and that doesn't prove that the rain caused the ground to be wet. It just means that it happens at the same time. Nevertheless, normal people will read that sentence and think the ground is wet when it rains implies that the ground is wet because it rains. That the natural way to read this is that the sons of God and the daughters of men were the reason that the Nephilim were there in that age. So that the cause of the Nephilim is the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Now, why is that significant? The Nephilim, who are they? The text says they are mighty men of old and men of renown. There's something about these men, these Nephilim, that make them different than everybody else. They're mighty and they're men of renown. Now, there are some traditions that suggest that Nephilim refers to giants, and perhaps it's true that these men were giant, but all the text really says is that they were men of renown, so men of giant reputation, heroes of some sort. More than that, what the text really is implying, if the angel view is correct, is that these men were some sort of demigod. So when you think of old stories like the story of Hercules or Perseus, or even older than that, the story of Gilgamesh, or any old king like Pharaoh who claimed to be the son of the god Ra, the Egyptian god Ra, or Julius Caesar, who claimed himself to be the son of Julia, they're all claiming that they have some sort of divine parentage, and that's what makes them special or elevated over all other human beings. That seems to be what Nephilim implies, that Nephilim is some sort of demigod. The text says that they existed before and they existed afterwards, right? So it seems like the text is saying that we've always had people claiming to be Nephilim, claiming to be demigods, or having authority and power and uniqueness above all other human beings because they were the children of the gods in some sense. And this text seems to be suggesting that all of that originated and started back in this event where the concept of Nephilim is born, when there's actually fallen angelic beings who have some sort of relationship with human beings. And these people are conceived of as being children of the gods. All right, that's how we understand the Nephilim, if you believe it that Genesis 6 is referring to the sons of God as angels. All right, let's move on. Reason number 6. We only have 7, so reason number 6 that you should believe that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are referring to angels are 2 important passages in the New Testament. 2 Peter 2 verses 4 and 5 and Jude verse 6 both make most sense, or both make seem most clear if we interpret Genesis 6 as referring to angels when it talks about the sons of God. For context, let me read those 2 passages. 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 and 5 say, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. And if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, ... He goes on to say, then we can't expect him to spare us for our ungodliness. But here he's saying God doesn't spare the angels when they sin, and God doesn't spare the ancient world at the time of Noah when they sinned. And he puts those 2 stories together. Jude 6, he says, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, and serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. All right, both of these passages are a little bit strange to our ears. They both describe angels who have already received the judgment of God and are being kept in hell in chains of gloomy darkness, awaiting the day of final judgment. And that strikes us as strange because we don't believe, the Bible doesn't teach generally, that Satan and his angels will be thrown into hell until that final day. So why is it that there are some angels that have already been judged and are already being kept in chains of gloomy darkness? Now, there are some clues in both of those passages. First, Peter connects this story with the story of Noah's flood. I think that's a huge point. He says that God didn't spare the angels, and in the same way, he did not spare the ancient world, and he puts those in the exact same sentence. And that seems to suggest it's because they come from the exact same event. The angels who sinned with the humans both received judgment at that time that was unique and really total at that time. The worldwide flood and the judgment of those angels who were in rebellion was a extreme judgment at that time that goes beyond God's judgment of any other angel to that point. All right. The other connection is in Jude. He mentions angels in reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. And the link between those 2 stories seems to be the concept of leaving their own position of authority and proper dwelling Sodom and Gomorrah is a famous story in part because there's homosexual men who want to rape other men. And that in and of itself is a kind of leaving of a proper dwelling. They're not operating in accords to how they're created sexually. But in that story, it's also true that two angels come to rescue Lot and lead him away from Sodom and Gomorrah before God destroys that city. And instead, what happens is that the men of the city rise up. They want to rape those two angels, thinking that they were men. But in reality, they're trying to rape two angels in that story, which is another wild story in our mind. And it seems that maybe Jude is linking these stories because you have both the sexual deviancy act and the judgment of, or at least the connection of angelic and human sin, that we're all tied into those stories. And it just seems to suggest that these three stories logically go together because of this content. I'll read to you what Michael Heiser said. He said, scholars agree that the passages are about the same subject matter. They describe an episode from the time of Noah and the flood where the angels sinned. That sin which precipitated the flood was sexual in nature. It is placed in the same category as the sin which prompted the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. The transgression was interpreted by Peter and Jude as evidence of despising authority and the boundaries of proper dwelling for the parties concerned. All of those elements are transparent in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. There is simply no other sin in the Old Testament that meets these specific details, and no other angelic sin at all in the Old Testament that might be the referent. In other words, if people disagree that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is the event that is being described in Jude and 2 Peter, then they have to say that there is no record in the Bible of what Jude and Peter are talking about, which is possible. Right? The Bible doesn't record every single event in history. However, most scholars think, well, there are clues in the text that do give us enough context to be able to understand why certain angels and certain humans were judged for these behaviors in the Old Testament. And so I think that if you have evidence, it's reasonable to assume that that evidence is connected in the ways that Jude and 2 Peter seem to imply. All right, last reason. Reason number 7 that you should believe that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are angels is because that is what most ancient sources taught. Now, I've already mentioned that this is what most scholars taught, but I want to really kind of zero in on the idea that this was the ancient worldview that was held by most people at the time that the Bible was written. So when the Bible was written in the time of Jesus and Jesus' disciples, this was the overwhelmingly held view by all people, not just Christians, but Jews as well. We know that because of works that are contemporary to the Bible, but they're not part of the Bible. They're usually referred to as the Jewish Apocrypha. These works are not inspired. They're not inerrant. You are not required to believe that everything written in them is true. Nonetheless, they are sources that are filled with references to these events described in Genesis 6, and they clearly demonstrate that at that time in history, there was a widespread belief that the Bible taught that there was some sort of union between angels and humans. I'll give you a few quotes from some modern commentaries. Perhaps one of the most famous scholars on sort of Old Testament background, with reference to, he's a New Testament scholar, but he talks a lot about cultural background at the time, is a man named Craig Keener. He wrote that one of the most prominent themes of ancient Jewish tradition, though usually suppressed by the later rabbis, was the idea that the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1 through 3 were angels who lusted after women and so fell. And then he lists tons of examples: the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1st Enoch, Jubilees, 2nd Baruch, the Testament of Reuben, Philo, and I gave a longer list earlier that we could include as well. Let me cite another person, Gordon Wenham, who I've mentioned several times already. The angel interpretation is at once the oldest view and that of most modern commentators. It is assumed in the earliest Jewish exegesis. For example, the books of 1st Enoch, Jubilees, the Septuagint, Philo, Josephus, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he goes on to talk about early Christian writers as well. Of course, older is not always better. But at the same time, newer isn't always better either. We don't want to believe that chronological snobbery is a virtue, that believing that an idea that is new is better than an old idea is just arrogance. What we need to ask is, are these views compelling? Now, I will say that I believe that one reason that they're compelling is because it was a widespread view that was held at the time that the New Testament is written. And there are some clues that the New Testament authors, especially Peter and Jude, are writing with awareness of these books and even referencing them in their own writings, which is a clue that they may have held and likely held some of these same views. All right, those are my 7 reasons why you should believe that the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 are referring to fallen angels. Now, I have great friends already that disagree with me, and I know that many of you who watch this will disagree, and I invite you to tear up my arguments and give me arguments for your reasons that you would hold a different view. And if you agree with me and there's some reasons that I didn't bring out, I'd love to hear those as well. Hopefully this will set you up to have many, many hours of fun debate with your friends.